All right, so of interest probably to you about learning and memory. So let's begin by looking at what is memory and what brain areas will be affiliated with it. So this, as we are not surprised, is a complex system with many different structures and regions. However, there are some that predominate over others. So a lot of studies of memory have actually come out of people with amnesia. And this is due to the reveal that areas of the temporal lobe, the hippocampus, the caudate nucleus, and the thalamus are all involved with memory. So let's begin with the amygdala. And the amygdala here, as a reminder, this is important for learning fear responses. And also this is important for implicit memory formation as well. Then we have the prefrontal cortex in the frontal lobe. So this may be involved in complex problem solving and working memory. And again, is something that does not develop fully until we're about 25 years of age. And it's also important for very short-term memory. So like if you're remembering a grocery list or somebody's phone number and then put it right into your phone. Another region too that we have for the cerebral cortex, predominantly here in this left inferior lobe, is with mathematical calculations as well. So the hippocampus, this one is probably one of the most important ones and is a critical component for memory. So this is when we acquire new information and then we can consolidate long or short-term memory into long-term memory. Also, we have the temporal lobe, so this is important for storage of long-term visual memories. And also we have visual cortex that will be involved with that. Our auditory cortex is important for auditory memory as well, more of the short-term memory. So short-term memory, what this is when we have memory of recent events. So transferring information from short-term memory to long-term memory is called memory consolidation. And so this actually requires activation of genes, production of new proteins, and also formation of new synapses. So this happens within the temporal lobe, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. So sleep is needed for optimal memory consolidation. Again, this is important for why you should sleep before you have like a quiz or exam or a final project or presentation, because you're able to convert that short-term memory into long-term memory. And it appears that having a 3-hour delay between the learning sessions helps. So if you're studying, say, physiology, you might want to take a break for 3 hours and then revisit it later, okay? That will help with that. So emotional arousal can also enhance or inhibit storage as well. So a lot of this has to do with how much cortisol is being released as well. So within the hippocampus, we also need to have a lot of glycogenolysis, where we take glycogen and convert that to glucose, and also lactate production seems to be really important too. So having a continuous supply of energy is important for that conversion of short-term memory to long-term memory. With long-term memory, this again requires actual structural changes, unlike short-term memory. We'll have activation of genes, we'll have synthesis of mRNA, production of proteins, and formation of new synapses that will occur. So there are two different types of long-term memory. So the first one is non-declarative, and these are implicit memories, so skills of how to do things. And so if we look here, this is our example of implicit memories. So how to ride a bicycle, being more likely to use a word you recently read, and then also feeling anxiety when you are in a dentist's office would all be examples of non-declarative memories. Now, declarative or explicit, these are memories that can be verbalized. And so here in this example, what we have are two different ones. So episodic, this is different events. So these can last from minutes to years that you recall. Semantic, this is where we remember facts. So like knowing that monkeys have tails. And this can take minutes to years in terms of how long they're stored. So in order for us to have memory and synaptic changes that occur, short-term memory involves this recurrent circuit where neurons synapse on each other in a circle. So with recurrent circles or circuits, these must be maintained for some period of time. So like with working memory, remembering a shopping list, so repeating it over and over and over to get that into short-term memory. So if we have interruption of the circuit, that will destroy the memory because there was no actual structural change. So if you're trying to remember your shopping list, but then say somebody's talking to you in the back of the car, or your favorite song comes on, then you might forget your shopping list. Okay, long-term memory requires a permanent change in the neuron's actual structure and synapse. And so we'll have protein synthesis that's required for the consolidation of this memory trace. And usually this depends on glutamate as being the excitatory neurotransmitter, where how strong the memory is will depend on the amount of neurotransmitter that's being released. And also then how many receptors then are going to be inserted on that postsynaptic cell. So that would make the synapse then very sensitive to once we're exposed to that memory again, or if we're trying to retrieve that memory. So the mechanism by which we have long-term potentiation or long-term memory occurring has to do with these following steps. So typically we see this within the hippocampus, but this can happen at other places as well within the brain. So first, glutamate is going to bind to AMPA receptors, and AMPA stands for alpha amino 3 hydroxy 5 methyl 4 isoxylopropionic acidic receptor. Okay, so that's a mouthful, right? So we're just going to stick with AMPA. All right, so when glutamate binds to these AMPA receptors on the postsynaptic cell, this allows sodium to come in and causing an excitatory postsynaptic potential. Okay, so it's getting closer to threshold. So when we have then depolarization, this is going to release then magnesium from blocking these NMDA receptors, which is short for N-methyl-D-aspartame receptors. And so then the NMDA will allow calcium and sodium to come into that postsynaptic cell. Calcium then will bind to calmodulin, which is going to activate like the secondary messenger system. And then that's going to activate CAMK2, which is calcium calmodulin dependent protein kinase 2. And which that causes more AMPA receptors to then fuse on the plasma membrane, and then so now we'll have that structural change and genetic change of transcription factor producing more mRNA and more protein. Also, what we'll have is nitric oxide that is being released, which is important for that formation of those memories. So all in all, with this whole process, what we have is that these kinases, so here like calmodulin, CAMK2, are phosphorylating and signaling nuclear proteins that lead to then protein changes, so adding more proteins, more mRNA, and also changing the actual structure of the neuron so that we can have more of a genetic expression to increase the amount of synthesis of that protein. What we're seeing here, this is kind of a visual of what was just explained in those steps for that mechanism of long-term potentiation. So here we have neurotransmitter. Again, the neurotransmitter that is going to be glutamate. Glutamate then is going to bind to those AMPA receptors, and then we'll have that removal of that magnesium. And so we can have sodium and calcium that's going to come in. Okay. So if this continues on, so say if you're like learning this material, you're repeating it over and over and listening to lectures, say for like a week or more, then what happens is you actually are generating more of the glutamate neurotransmitter. So that's actually increasing the amount of receptors that are found in the postsynaptic cell. And so this is the structural change that we're seeing and genetic change due to more proteins that are being inserted, because if you remember, these receptors, they're just proteins, okay? And so you'll have more sodium, more calcium that comes in, and so what we'll see here is a higher amount to have a depolarization occurring as compared to information that you learned, say, a week ago. So it is true that repetition is key in terms of learning different information so that you can have that information convert from short-term memory into long-term memory. So the changes that we see then on the actual neuron are called dendritic spines, okay? So this is going to increase during long-term potentiation on pyramidal neurons, which are found within the cerebral cortex, hippocampus, and amygdala. And this is due to the increase in number of the AMPA receptors on that postsynaptic membrane and increase then the synaptic strength. And so here, if you see, I'm going to try and highlight these, but can't see, I guess. Here, let's do this in white. These little lines are representing those dendritic spines, okay? So the more dendritic spines you have then, the more conversion you have gone from short-term memory to long-term memory. So physical activity has been something that has been associated with an increase in the amount of dendritic spines as well as an enriched environment. So what this means is like listening to classical music, doing Sudoku, or like those brain teasers like luminosity like on your phones, especially among the elderly too. It's to keep from those dendritic spines to die off. However, over time, though, naturally, due to environmental factors and stress, we have a decrease in the amount of dendritic spines, and also like clinical case of Alzheimer's disease really starts to have death of those dendritic spines. So long-term memory has been completely wiped out.